Hello and welcome back to Reimagining Cyber. If you followed cybersecurity news lately, and I presume that you do if you're listening to this, then you've probably noticed it feels like every week brings another major breach. One week it's retail, the next week it's an airline, then it's an insurance company, then it's a cryptocurrency platform. The victims change, the industries change, and the attackers sometimes change. And with me to talk about this is our very own cybersecurity Tyler Moffitt, because he has recently argued that many of these breaches are actually telling the same story. Tyler, how are you?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on. And honestly, that's exactly right. You see these headlines, people read the headlines, they naturally focus on what's different, who was hit this time, what were the attackers, right? Scattered spider or what, like different industry, what industry was hit. But honestly, there's patterns that emerge, right? You look at the breaches, you focus on what's the same. And honestly, what's interesting to me is that today's biggest incidents are like the same patterns. Sure, the details change on the company and the attacker and the industry, but the attack chain itself really doesn't.
Why do you think people are seeing these incidents as completely separate events?
Well, I can get it because it is a separate attack, but the headlines focus on the victim, right? And that's understandable. Major airline breached, retail giant attacked, cryptocurrency change compromised or drained of funds. That one's real popular, but that's what grabs attention, right? And that's their job, to grab attention, get the clicks, get the views. But attackers don't organize themselves around industries, right? They organize around techniques, vulnerabilities. And many of these techniques keep showing up over and over again.
Which begs the question then, what are those techniques?
So I would simplify most modern breaches into a sequence. It would look something like this: initial access, identity compromise, privilege escalation, and then, moving laterally to get data access, data exfiltration, extortion, maybe ransomware, maybe not. We're seeing some, crews there decide whether if they want to have ransomware or not. Just stealing the data itself is enough now to get a ransom payment. But some, obviously locking the files is big too. But that's basically it, right? Get the access, identity compromise, escalate the privilege, move laterally, get the data, and then extort them, with ransomware or not. And that's basically what we're seeing every time.
Let's start then at the beginning. How are these attackers getting in?
So it's a good one to talk about. People assume every breach starts with some sophisticated attack, and they don't most of the time. They get in through basically very familiar methods. We talked about this last week, talking about, patching and the dwell time that we talk about. It's either identity or the, patch management of something else. So phishing, social engineering, credential theft, exploiting an unpatched VPN, help desk manipulation, or click fix. That's a new one. We talked about that a few episodes ago, where users are basically tricked into infecting themselves by copying, PowerShell into a run window, or stolen session tokens. That's pretty big. There's an underground economy for buying those, where your tokens are literally sold on the dark web, and they just log right in. No breaking in required. The specific technique can sometimes change, but the goal is the same, right? Get a foothold, get inside. And then once you're inside, that's it. Everything else comes later.
Yeah, they're not necessarily trying to compromise the entire organization on day one.
Exactly. Just get through one person, through one door. Once you're inside, the real work begins. You bring in different payloads, tons of stuff.
Let's play this out then. Once attackers have gained that access, what's next?
Identity. Well, most every time, right? Such a central security topic. That's what they want. Credentials, tokens, privileged accounts, MFA reset capability, administrative access, right? That's what they want. Because if they control identity, they can move through an environment without triggering the kinds of alerts that malware used to generate, right? They legitimate accounts, legitimate access, legitimate tools. It makes them much harder to spot.
This sounds a lot like some of the scattered spider attacks that we discussed a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, that's why they're so popular, and people are using it. It's not just Scattered Spider doing it; like they sort of set the playbook that now everybody's doing. It's a very clean example. No malware involved required, just identity compromise. They're good at convincing the IT help desk of organizations to just give them access. Like, I'm an employee, I'm locked out of my machine, help me in. Here's my information that I got that I fished from that individual. I've proven to you now that I am that individual. Please let me in. and they get in, they look like legitimate users, and that's where it's dangerous.
One thing, Tyler, that's changed over the past few years is the role of data theft. Why has that become so important?
Leverage. Attackers realize something, right? Encrypting systems definitely creates leverage, but stealing data creates potentially even more leverage. And actually, the larger your organization is, that data being stolen is even more leverage than locking access to the files, because you might have a good, backup or redundancy or worst case scenario plan that you've done dry runs and tabletop exercises for. But once the data has been exfiltrated, especially if it's like customer data, really, really bad. I mean, you think about the damage to brand and reputation, the crisis comms you've got to deal. Think about the shareholders, right? Especially if it's been leaked. And then what about GDPR and CCPA, the data privacy governing regulators, who then hear about the breach through the leak site and not from you directly, and you're supposed to be notifying them within X amount of days or as soon as you know. And if you don't, you face fines of like 2% of your flat revenue. I mean, it's a nightmare, right? That's what they want, right? That's why it's all involves extortion right now. You don't even always need the traditional ransomware encrypt your payload stuff. Once they get access, they steal the sensitive information, threaten publication, demand payment, right? And so I would say there are groups now out there that you might call a ransomware group, but they don't actually encrypt any files. They just steal the data because they don't need to encrypt anything. Just the data theft alone is enough to extort you. From just exposure of the data and the breach versus the downtime.
And judging from the passion with which you speak there, that's becoming increasingly common.
Absolutely. I'd say the past few years, we started to see increasingly more organizations doing that. In fact, the largest, I don't want to call it, I think ransom payment is what you want to call it. I think it was like $70 million paid to Dark Angels. They never even encrypted a thing. They just exfiltrated like 10 terabytes from a Fortune 50 company, which is huge, right? These are extortion first operators, Dark Angels. There's tons out there. There's more and more and more and more. They understand that organizations really care about their data, not just themselves from the damage to brand and reputation, but also from, stock price and public, opinion. It's a really big important part. And potentially too, intellectual property. They might be sitting on something that's really important that they don't want to go out, and because it could, be the keys to the kingdom as far as what their business model is. If attackers can get that, they have all the leverage they need.
If attackers know the playbook, why does it keep working?
Playbook works. I mean, I wish I had a better. That's the answer. I mean,
Okay.
attackers aren't rewarded for creativity necessarily. They're rewarded for results, right? What works, what gets you in, what gets you the data. If social engineering like Scattered Spider works with the help desk IT resets, if that works, they're going to do it. If the phishing gets the access, they're going to do that. If exploiting the edge devices and the vulnerable VPNs and firewalls and whatever gets access, they'll do that. Attackers don't get bonus points for like innovation. They get paid when they're in, when they succeed. And so many of these techniques just continue succeeding, and that's what they're going to do.
It's operational efficiency. It's not sophistication, really.
Yeah, exactly. Right. People imagine hackers, they think they're writing code specifically advanced just for this target. And it's like, yes, those people do exist. And but, many of today's attacks, it doesn't involve that. Right. It's just process, patience, psychology, and operational discipline. Some cyber criminal groups operate more like a business model versus like hackers. Sure, they have specialization, but it's process, documentation, division of labor. They figured out, what works, and they keep repeating it. They have certain people specialized in certain little areas, and they just keep having them focus and be better at their one little area.
Okay, then time for everyone in the class to sit up, pay attention, and take some notes. Because what are the lessons for organizations?
I think the lesson is that breach prevention isn't about chasing every new headline. It's about understanding the business model or the attack chain, right? Because if you understand the attack chain, you start seeing the common patterns that I see, which is how they get in, how they gain trust, how do they, escalate privileges, how do they move laterally, how do they exfiltrate the data, and then monetize, right? And once you understand those stages, you can build defenses around them.
Can you give me an example of that?
Sure. Let's take two completely different headlines. So one might involve ransomware and the other might involve data extortion. And at first they seem unrelated, but if we start with the compromised credentials and weak identity controls, then the defensive lesson is very similar, right? The headlines are different, but the root problem isn't. The way they came in is likely one of two ways, right? Identity, compromising the identity, or coming in because you didn't patch management, vulnerability of an edge device that you didn't realize that you hadn't patched, or maybe you just wasn't getting around to it. It was next month, something like that. It's like one of those two ways as far as how they get in. As far as the tools they use to escalate privilege, the tools they use to move laterally, and the tools they use to exfiltrate data, it's pretty much all the same. And then it's like the decision at the end of, do I drop a ransomware payload at the end, or do I just tab the data exfiltration and that's good enough for me? That can be the different decision. But again, headlines only jump up and down and scream about which ransomware payload did they use? Was it Black Cat? Was it, there's so many different groups out there that target specific industries. And it's like ultimately they're the same playbook.
Okay, let's wrap things up now then. I'm hoping that listeners will remember every single word that you've uttered over the last few minutes or so. But if there was one particular thing that they should be taking away, that they should remember, what should it be?
You don't get distracted by the brand or logo and the headline that was hit. Focus on the technique. Every week the victim changes, the industry changes, the company name changes, right? But the attack path and plan is pretty similar, surprisingly similar, right? And if organizations spend more time understanding how breaches happen rather than simply just who got breached, they'll be much more prepared for what comes next.
Fantastic, Tyler. Great insights as always.
Thanks for having me on, Ben. Appreciate it.
So the next breach headline, it may involve a different company, a different industry, or a different attacker, but the chances are that the underlying attack chain will look very familiar. Understanding that playbook may be one of the most valuable things a security team can do. Thanks so much for listening to Reimagining Cyber. Do remember to rate, review, and recommend the show. Goodbye.